I only married you because you're the boss's daughter, my husband Oliver said with a smirk as I lay sick in bed. His words stung, as did the sight of the scarves and gloves I had lovingly knitted for him, discarded like they were worthless. He seemed oblivious to the pain his disappointment caused me, but if he thought he held all the cards in our marriage, he was sorely mistaken. Just imagining the shock of his realization brought a small chuckle to my lips. My name is Stacy Morgan, and I've been married to Oliver for 5 years. We don't have children, but until recently, I thought we were happy together. Oliver, a workaholic, often spends long hours away from home, leaving me lonely at times. Yet, he always made an effort to prioritize us on his days off, making those lonely hours bearable. We met through my father, who was once Oliver's boss. After we got married, Oliver suggested I become a stay-at-home wife. It made sense at the time. I had the freedom to explore my interests. While supporting Oliver, I bonded with neighbors, took up fitness, and eventually discovered a passion for sewing and knitting. Every winter, I made him scarves and gloves. Though my early attempts were amateurish, I improved over time. Oliver once told me my creations were as good as store-bought items, and his praise spurred me on. I even dreamed of a future where we might sew together with our child. When I shared this thought with him, he smiled and said, "Maybe I'll join in and learn when the time comes." That memory brought me so much joy. I devoted myself to supporting Oliver, managing our home, and cherishing the time we spent together. From the outside, my life might have seemed idyllic. I was grateful for his high salary and the stability it brought us. I thought this peaceful life would continue indefinitely, quietly, happily, with the prospect of a child someday. But 2 years ago, cracks began to form in that dream. One evening, while waiting for Oliver to come home, I suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed. Oliver rushed me to the hospital. When I woke up in a hospital bed, I overheard the doctor telling him my condition wasn't mild, it was something I'd have to manage for the rest of my life. Though it wasn't immediately life-threatening, the prospect of future episodes was daunting. Oliver reassured me, holding my hand tightly, "You'll be in the hospital for a while, but don't worry, I'll visit whenever I can. We'll get through this together." His words eased my fears, and I clung to the hope that his support would see me through. True to his promise, Oliver visited almost every day during that first year. He held my hand, asked about my day, and even brought my sewing tools to keep me entertained. We spent hours chatting and laughing as I taught him to sew. Those moments were a bright spot in an otherwise grim time, and they made me believe that everything would eventually be okay. But after a year, things changed. I handed Oliver the latest scarf I had knitted, a continuation of our yearly tradition. Shortly after, his visits became less frequent. Weeks passed between his appearances. My once supportive husband now felt like a stranger. And here we were, with him finally revealing the truth. I was nothing more than a stepping stone in his ambitions. The thought made my blood boil, but also filled me with determination. If Oliver believed he could walk over me without consequences, he was in for a rude awakening. At first, I thought my husband must be swamped with work, so I kept myself occupied with sewing, planning to give him my finished project the next time he visited. The doctor had mentioned I might be discharged by the end of the year, so I decided to make him a pair of gloves to mark the occasion. I poured all my feelings into crafting those gloves, hoping they would bridge the growing distance between us. When Oliver finally visited after weeks of silence, I eagerly handed him the gloves, but his reaction was chilling. He looked at them with disdain and said, "Are you still making these?" "Honestly, it's just a nuisance now." Before I could process his words, he handed me something, a pristine scarf I had knitted for him last year, and a set of divorce papers. The scarf, untouched and unworn, looked exactly as it had the day I gave it to him. "Has it been 2 years since you were hospitalized?" he said, his tone indifferent. "I heard you'll be discharged soon, but I can't keep taking care of you. We should get a divorce." His words were like a slap, but my gaze dropped to the divorce papers he had already signed. A strange calm washed over me. I had suspected this moment might come, especially after he stopped visiting without explanation. I had tried to dismiss my suspicions, convincing myself that he was just busy with work, but deep down, I knew better. The Oliver I knew, the man who had once promised we'd face everything together, would never have neglected me like this. Still, I managed to ask, "Why?" My voice was steady, more curious than distraught. I wasn't trying to cling to him, I simply wanted to understand. Oliver sighed, as if my question was an inconvenience. "Isn't it obvious? Ever since I married you, it's been one problem after another. I'm sick of those scarves and gloves you keep making me. They're embarrassing. Who even wears handmade things these days? I only married you because you were the boss's daughter. And now, with you getting sick. It's just too much. He laughed, a sharp, mocking sound, as if ridiculing the very life I had cherished. I glanced at his neck and saw a high-end scarf wrapped around it, one I didn't recognize. Its quality was far superior to anything I could make, and it didn't take much to realize he had never used any of my gifts. I suppose you never wore anything I made for you, I said quietly. The thought stung, but the truth was undeniable. Oliver shrugged. They were always a bother. I kept them because it seemed polite, but honestly, they just annoyed me. He went on, explaining everything with unsettling candor. After my father retired and was no longer at the company, Oliver no longer felt any need to keep up appearances with me. My illness, it seemed, had been more useful to him than I ever realized. For the first year, visiting you worked in my favor, he admitted. Your father used to talk about it at the office, and people thought I was some kind of saint, balancing work while taking care of my sick wife. It made me look good. If I worked overtime, I was praised for being responsible. If I needed a break, all I had to do was mention your condition, and everyone was sympathetic. I stared at him, my heart growing heavier with each word. My name's even up for the next promotion, he added, smirking. They're all idiots, but I have to thank your illness for that. When he finally finished, I looked up, meeting his gaze. My heart no longer felt broken, it felt resolute. What I saw was an ugly grin on his face. The man I once loved was completely gone. This was his true nature, plain as day. Well, if I was of any use to you, I guess that's something, I said calmly, handing back the divorce papers. Take care. He accepted the papers without a second thought, turned on his heel, and left. Just like that, our marriage ended. I sat in silence for a long while, and then, unable to hold it in, I wept quietly. After my discharge from the hospital, I moved back in with my parents. When my father heard about what Oliver had done, he was livid. I can't believe he turned out to be such a scumbag, he shouted. But to me, it didn't matter anymore. I reassured him, telling him I wanted to return to my childhood home after wrapping up loose ends at the house Oliver and I had shared. My parents were understanding, urging me to take things at my own pace. Before settling at my parents' home, I decided to visit the house I once called my own. However, when I arrived, I was met with an unexpected problem. The front door lock wouldn't open. Confused, I glanced at my parents, and we decided to ring the doorbell. A stranger answered. Bewildered, I asked about the situation, and the man explained that he had purchased the house several months ago. He now lived there happily with his wife and child. My parents were furious, but I didn't want to disrupt the new family. Bowing my head, I quietly left. Still, I couldn't leave things unresolved. I immediately contacted Oliver. When he answered the phone, his tone was casual, even flippant. Oh, yeah. I sold the house while you were in the hospital. The sale money? Consider it compensation. It was my house, after all, so you have no right to complain. His words were a punch to the gut, but I exhaled slowly, refusing to let him get under my skin. You could have at least told me, I said evenly. From what I gathered from the new homeowner, the house had been sold over a year ago, likely around the time Oliver stopped visiting me. Even if he had been planning a divorce back then, selling the house without discussing it with me was outrageous. Our divorce had been finalized when we signed the papers, but we'd agreed to discuss asset division after my discharge. We had even scheduled a meeting for next week. Yet, Oliver had taken matters into his own hands, completely disregarding any prior agreements. What angered me most was his utter lack of remorse. You really don't understand anything, do you? I said calmly. What do you mean? He replied, sounding genuinely puzzled. I'll explain everything next week, I said, then hung up. Turning to my worried parents, I told my father, I need your help with something. I shared my thoughts, and he nodded, his anger fueling his resolve. I'll prepare everything you need, he said with a determined smile. There's not much time, but we'll manage. I thanked him, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. As I imagined Oliver's reaction at our upcoming meeting, I couldn't help but smile. The day of the meeting arrived, and we convened at my parents' home. My parents and I sat together, facing Oliver, who sat alone. Despite knowing my parents were hurt by the divorce, he showed no sign of regret. In fact, he appeared smug, even allowing a faint smile to play on his lips. I'm the victim here, he said arrogantly. But I don't intend to demand too much. The proceeds from the sale of the house will suffice. His tone was magnanimous, as though he were doing us a favor. My father's face turned crimson with anger, but I gently placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to remain calm. There was no need for us to lose our composure. There's something important we need to discuss first, I said. My father presented a document and laid it on the table. This, I explained, is proof that the land on which the house stood is owned by my father. Oliver's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. So what? The house was in my name. That's all that matters, he said dismissively. True, I conceded, the house was yours. But the land was not. Oliver chuckled, his laugh dripping with condescension. You think you can trip me up with that? Pathetic. But this time, his confidence would be his downfall. I continued, legally, my husband may have been within his rights when he sold the house. But legalities aside, his actions have created a significant issue for the family who purchased it. Since my father owns the land beneath the house, he could demand rent from them. Don't you think that would be a problem for them? I asked, letting the weight of my words settle. The family was misled, they weren't told the full story. Neither my father nor I intend to take such a drastic step as charging rent or forcing them to leave. However, we're not willing to give up our land rights for free either. The logical solution would be to sell the land to the family so they can consolidate their ownership. I paused before continuing. Of course, the family is now burdened with an unexpected expense they weren't informed about. If they have to pay for the land, they'll likely demand reimbursement from you, Oliver. If you can't resolve this amicably, they may sue you for failing to disclose the land ownership during the sale. Imagine their frustration, finally buying their dream home, only to learn they're responsible for additional costs. After obtaining proof of my father's ownership of the land, we visited the new homeowners. Thankfully, they were understanding when we explained the situation. They agreed that if a lawsuit were necessary, it would be against the seller, my husband. When I described this scenario, I watched Oliver's face grow pale. The realization hit him, and in a trembling voice, he asked, "What should I do?" Smiling, I replied, "The simplest solution is for the family to purchase the land from us. You'll need to compensate them for that cost to avoid further conflict. This way, the family can fully own both the house and the land, and the matter will be resolved smoothly." I leaned forward. However, you should know that the land is in a prime location. Its value may exceed what you earned from selling the house. Even if you liquidate all your assets, it might not cover the cost. Alternatively, you could repurchase the house and land, but you'd also need to pay the family a relocation fee. Either way, you're going to lose money. His shoulders slumped as he realized the truth. I continued, "Also, I plan to claim compensation for emotional distress. Your actions caused me immense suffering, and while the evidence is limited, pursuing this matter will highlight your treatment of me. That alone could be significant, given your current predicament." Oliver's eyes widened as my father spoke next. "Even though I'm retired, I still have connections at the company. I've heard plenty about how you used my daughter to climb the corporate ladder. Your colleagues are beginning to see your true colors, and your reputation is crumbling. That promotion you were aiming for? It's already out of reach." Oliver's confidence shattered. The money he gained from selling the house, the respect he once commanded at work, everything was slipping through his fingers. "Now," I said, my tone calm but firm, "let's discuss what happens next. We'll decide how to handle the division of property, the compensation, and the matter of the land." For the first time since our separation, I smiled, truly smiled. I was no longer the person Oliver had exploited. As I spoke, Oliver could only force a hollow laugh, tears glistening in his eyes. The subsequent negotiations heavily favored me. Oliver agreed to pay alimony and reimburse the family for the land. We later explained this resolution to the new homeowners, ensuring their peace of mind. In the end, everyone benefited, except Oliver. Rumors, fueled by my father's network, began circulating at Oliver's workplace. His standing within the company crumbled, and his promotion was officially revoked. Within weeks, he resigned, unable to face the damage to his reputation. It felt like karma had caught up to him. What he had gained through manipulation and deceit vanished as easily as it had come. As for me, I found peace living with my parents. I now run a small sewing class, sharing my passion with local women and children, though I never had the chance to start a family of my own. Teaching others has brought me unexpected joy. In giving others the happiness I once sought, I've finally found it for myself.